And we're here today for three reasons. One, we want to report on the effectiveness of this legislature during the first 6 months of its two-year session. Our research has shown that the legislature, the State House of Representatives, and the State Senate do not represent our best interests, the citizens of Pennsylvania. And this legislature avoids the issues and problems that we elect them to come here to solve. We are here because Harrisburg is broken. And our third reason that we are here is because we believe that we, the people of Pennsylvania, can fix Harrisburg. We know that Harrisburg is broken because in 2017, Fair Districts PA supported a House redistricting reform bill that had more than half of the House of Representatives as co-sponsors. It was shown in polls that more than 70% of Pennsylvanians supported redistricting reform. We had members of our organization across the state meet with every legislator in the House and the Senate. Now, there were several who refused to meet with us. However, we had people, the constituents, willing to meet with every representative and every senator in the state. And despite all that support, our bill never got a vote out of committee in the House. In 2017, our redistricting bill was very strong, and we had done everything right, we had thought. And we wanted to know, why had a bill with such popular support, with such strong support in the legislature, why had this bill failed? How could it fail? So we needed to know what happened, and we did some research, and our research team discovered that our cause for redistricting reform was not the only citizen-driven bill that was ignored. Despite public support and support within the legislature, many bipartisan bills never received a floor vote. Nearly 75% of all bills introduced in the legislature die in committee without ever having a hearing or a vote. These are not bills that are discussed and debated and found wanting. These are bills that are ignored. There is wide consensus in Pennsylvania that the legislature is broken. If you mention to someone in Pennsylvania that Harrisburg is broken, unless you're talking to a legislator or that legislator's mother, you're not likely to get an argument. And what's even more disturbing, when you tell them that there's a way to fix Harrisburg, they will often scoff and say, good luck with that. People accept that Harrisburg is broken, and they assume, many of our neighbors assume, that what's wrong in Harrisburg is some sort of form of inefficient governmental inefficiency and bungling. It isn't. Harrisburg is broken on purpose. It is dysfunction by design. And last year, Fair Districts produced a report called Dysfunction by Design that highlighted the problems created when the legislative rules give a handful of party leaders control over which bills are heard and which are ignored. Legislative rules and gerrymandered districts are the root of the dysfunction in Harrisburg, preventing the legislature from acting on many bipartisan proposals that would improve the lives of Pennsylvania citizens. At the dawn of this session, we had some hope when then Speaker Rossi had a listening tour across the state and took comments from the public on how to fix the rules and what people wanted to see in the rules. And there were some few minor changes to House rules. For example, House constitutional amendments now require a public hearing, and House sexual harassment protections extend beyond employed staff. Those are good changes, and they make sense. But despite those few and a few other positive changes, nothing was done to ensure that bipartisan bills get a vote in committee, on the floor, and in both chambers. So we did a quarterly report, first quarter report. The first 6 months of this two-year session have passed, and we wanted to know what difference the new makeup of the legislature has made and what difference those rules have made. So we produced a report. It's a short report. This session to date has passed fewer laws than the past session. And as usual, the Pennsylvania legislature, the largest full-time legislature in the country, the third most expensive legislature in the country, is among the least productive legislatures in the country. In Pennsylvania, during each two-year session, more than 4,000 bills are introduced, and that is a ridiculous number of bills. Again, nearly 75% die in committee without a hearing. Pennsylvania taxpayers pay millions of dollars to have those bills drafted, printed, distributed, only to be tossed in the trash without a hearing. Legislatures in our neighboring states have part-time legislatures, and they complete a budget and are in and out of session by May, by June. They're done, and they've passed hundreds of bills, passed the budget. And meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, we're still wrangling over the budget. So what we want to do is to fix Harrisburg. And the problem in Harrisburg is that the rules give control over the legislative process to 6 gatekeepers, partisan gatekeepers. We need to make a change. If that doesn't change, nothing is going to change. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jodi Reese, and I'm part of the Fair Districts research team. Full disclosure, I am an engineer, and before that, I wrote satellite software for NASA, which is a way of saying I'm a geek. So this boils down to the fact that data and spreadsheets and research is in my DNA, and working on this team has been a perfect match for me. I want you all to know that when we start the report, working with both the one from last December as well as this one, we have our questions to answer about the performance of the legislature. We don't know the answers. We're not looking for a particular result. We use the data available from the General Assembly on a public website to analyze the performance of our legislature. So this morning, this document that Tony was talking about, this 20-page document, was hand-delivered to all 253 representatives and senators. It was emailed yesterday, and they have paper copies now, encouraging them to look it over, ask questions, and comment on it. In that document, the questions that we ask are things like, how many and what bills have passed? This is for the first 6 months of this 2-year session. How did our legislature compare with New York, Maryland, Virginia during the same time period? How does this 6-month period compare to the two previous sessions in Pennsylvania, going back to 2019? Are the important bipartisan bills that died at the end of last session, are they being brought up again and given new life? How is the collaboration between the House and the Senate? How many bills do the House pass on to the Senate ignores, and vice versa? And finally, there's a little something that we sadly call death by amendment, where the rules are used and abused and ignored. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. I'm going to start with death by amendment. In our Constitution and in both the House and Senate rules, it states that no bill shall have more than one subject. No bill shall be amended to change its original purpose. And every bill needs to be considered in both the House and the Senate on 3 separate days. So in May of this year, House Bill 479, essentially a 1-page bill, was introduced to address mileage reimbursement for ambulance service. It was unanimously reported out of the House Veteran Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee. It had 3 considerations in the House and passed unanimously. It went to the Senate Health and Human Services Committee, passed out unanimously, and it was given first and second considerations in the Senate. So the only thing remaining was third consideration and final. So what happened? On June 29th, there was a quickly announced Senate Appropriations Committee meeting. It was held at 6:30 at night. And now this one-page bill is 20 pages long, and it includes a student voucher program. The original purpose of the bill was changed. It now contains a new subject, and neither the House nor the Senate has looked at this bill in this language for 3 separate days. And since it's a new educational program, it should be noted that neither the House Education Committee nor the Senate Appropriation Committee ever had this bill. The Senate has a rule, Rule 12, that says an amended bill can't have final vote for 10 hours after the amendment is adopted. 10 hours. A mere 45 minutes later, after the adoption, the Senate Majority Leader moved to suspend the rule, Rule number 12. And that's their Rule 25. And in fact, Rule 25 says that they can suspend a rule at any time, any rule, with a simple majority vote. And so they did, and they voted on the amended bill 45 minutes after it was amended, and it was passed. Loud protests, accusations followed, and as usual, nothing ultimately passed. This we call death by amendment. Neither issue ended up being addressed. And regardless of one's position on school voucher programs, this is not how the legislature is supposed to pass bills. The next example is about collaboration. In our previous research, we found for the last 7 years that half of the bills that the Senate passed, the House never took up. In the Senate, House bills that came to the Senate, over 60% of those bills never got a vote. Last session, that percentage was about 50% going either direction. But what we noticed when we looked at the data was of those bills that was ignored by the second chamber, half of them passed the first chamber unanimously. I was just asked today, well, how do you define bipartisan support of a bill? Well, there's many ways to do it. But guess what? I don't think anybody can argue with the fact that if a bill passes out of one of the chambers unanimously, you can't possibly be any more bipartisan. Yet those 200 bills last session were ignored and died at the end of the session. And these are just 2 examples of why rules reform is desperately needed. The research team will continue to watch the performance and will be reporting back to you. We know that the first 6 months was a little rockier, so we will continue to be looking at it and getting the information back to you and back to the legislators. There is time for improvement from our legislature, and we're hoping for that improvement, improving their performance and better rules, so that critical bipartisan solutions are afforded deliberations and a vote, as it should be. Thank you.
Estimados damas y caballeros de la prensa, distinguidos representantes y compatriotas amables, gracias por invitarme para hablar hoy en nombre de mis prójimos hispanos. Yo me llamo Duncan MacLean y aunque me crié en Cuba, la Argentina, he realizado toda mi carrera profesional aquí en Pensilvania. Y por los últimos 5 años me he ofrecido como voluntario con Fair Districts. What I just said is, esteemed ladies and gentlemen of the press, distinguished representatives and kind compatriots, thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of our Hispanic neighbors. My name is Duncan MacLean, and although I grew up in Cuba and Argentina, I have spent my whole professional career here in Pennsylvania. and for the last 5 years have served as a volunteer with Fair Districts. I joined Fair Districts 5 years ago because when you have lived outside the country, you can perhaps see even more plainly the peril to our democracy posed by gerrymandering and corruption. It's like seeing our blue planet from one of Jodi's satellites in outer space, a broader perspective. And because even around my own family's Thanksgiving table right here on Earth, Americans seem to be turning on each other. So working with Fair Districts has given me the opportunity to connect with fellow citizens of all different backgrounds at rural county fairs and suburban election polls, and each one with issues like shoring up emergency first response system, broadband access, and mental health care. And in particular, to connect with Hispanic communities pushing for workforce development, affordable housing, and thorough and efficient education. Everyone I've talked to shared two things in common: consternation over our lawmakers' inaction over solutions to their issues, and indignation that this inaction is due to the rules that let any one of just 6 leaders unilaterally stop even widely supported bills in their tracks. This is exactly what happened, as Tony said, with the bill supported by Fair Districts to provide for an independent citizens redistricting commission to end gerrymandering and draw district maps that fairly represent all voters. As he said, we had over 100,000 petition signatures. 389 county and local resolutions, 110 bill co-sponsors, and 70% approval in an F&M poll, but one single committee chairperson refused to debate or vote on the bill. After all that hard work by me and other volunteers in every part of the state, what a slap in the face. We also heard the same frustration from Pennsylvania Lead-Free Promise, one of our partners, which is a coalition of almost 70 groups advocating to address Pennsylvania's lead problem. This coalition of healthcare groups, child advocates, housing groups, community groups pointed out that 18 of Pennsylvania's largest cities had more kids with high lead levels than even Flint, Michigan. In the final hours of last year's session, the legislature finally acted on their own commission study after 3 years of delay. But then at the last minute, the leaders watered down the bill to an almost meaningless sham. They could say, well, we did something, but as a retired healthcare professional myself, I was not impressed, and my Hispanic neighbors weren't impressed either. We Pennsylvanians don't need this kind of pretend legislation. So I'm sticking with this work. I'll keep helping Fair Districts with collecting petition signatures, which now number over 18,000 in favor of rules reform. Mientras tanto, les ruego a todos que se unan a la lucha para asegurar distritos justos y para reparar las reglas en Harrisburg. I urge fellow citizens throughout the state, old and young, rural and urban, from every background and language, to demand fair districts and rules reform so that our legislators can get down to work for us. Gracias. Thank you.
I'm Carol Kuniholm. I am chair of Fair Districts PA, and like those people behind me and our previous speakers, I am a volunteer. Thank you, Tony and Jodi, and all who worked on this report and spent long hours researching Pennsylvania's legislative process. Thank you to everyone who showed up early today to help deliver reports to every legislative office. And thank you, Duncan, and the many, many, many others who gave so much time this summer collecting petition signatures at fairs, festivals, community days, farmers markets, and other events all over our Commonwealth. As we said, we brought some of those petitions with us today. Here are some I was involved in. We brought some of these today. Every signature on these pages represents a conversation between an FDPA volunteer and another Pennsylvania citizen concerned about our legislative process. And I will confess, sometimes I am saddened in these conversations when I hear people's responses. Just a few weeks ago, I spent a day at Crocamo, a few blocks from here, asking people if they would like to sign a petition to help fix Pennsylvania's legislative process. Some people were genuinely curious. How would you do that? Term limits? Go back to a part-time legislature? Some people said they're all crooks. Vote them all out. Some people laughed, shook their heads, said, is that possible? Or good luck with that, and kept walking. What saddened and troubled me is that some responded with immediate anger and violent suggestions, as if every legislator in this building were evil, as if the bond between citizens and our state government is broken beyond repair. We know that for decades, Pennsylvania's legislative process has been heavily slanted toward leadership interests and partisan winner-take-all dynamics. For years, issues of great concern to voters have been ignored by a legislative process that caters to wealthy donors, industry lobbies, and the extreme edges of the partisan base. For years, needed reforms that would restore the voice of the people have been blocked. That includes redistricting reform, as you've heard today, and important changes to legislative rules, but also reform of an arcane, unaccountable budget process, campaign finance reform, legislative gift bans. It also includes rules to address the conflicts of interest that allow committee chairs to work for the entities they govern, and to end the revolving door that ensures legislative leaders plush jobs when they leave here if they cater to their future employers. Until those reforms take place, the citizen anger level will continue to rise. The deep distrust will continue to grow. That is dangerous for democracy. It is also dangerous for legislators and disheartening for all who run for office with ideas of ways to make PA a better place, only to see how hard, almost impossible it is to enact their carefully crafted solutions. FDPA volunteers and supporters who once worked inside these walls as legislators or policy staffers first raised the alarm with us and insisted we focus attention on rules in addition and in support of our work to end gerrymandering. According to them, from what they can see and from what former colleagues tell them, things here are not getting better, and they will not get better unless citizens demand change and unless legislators themselves insist on legislative rules that allow real representation. We have been asking for years now, what does it take to be heard inside these walls? Petitions? We have plenty. Resolutions from local governments? We have done that. One-on-one advocacy visits. We have met with every legislator who will visit with us, not once, as many times, across a period of years. Rallies, we had a very large one, the last very large one these walls have seen. Protests, letters to the editor, hundreds. We have done all of those things, as have scores of other Pennsylvania advocacy groups, some here today, some dating back decades. We've noticed that sometimes advocacy efforts result in bipartisan commissions and studies authorized by Senate or House resolutions. And we have also noticed that the recommendations from those studies are often introduced as bills, but rarely, very rarely, come to a final vote. In many cases, the committees that authorize the studies, those same committees, fail to even schedule discussion for the resulting recommended legislation. We've also noticed that top legislative priorities from major statewide associations are regularly ignored by disinterested committee chairs or legislative leaders. Last session, the top legislative priority of the PA Farm Bureau was called Welfare for Farmers by committee chair and never emerged from committee. The top legislative priority of the PA School Board Association was introduced in both chambers and never considered in either education committee. Top election concerns of the County Commissioner Association were ignored before the 2020 election and have yet to be given a vote, despite continued urgent requests. We have heard the excuses. Legislation takes time. The process is messy. We have divided government. Sometimes it takes multiple sessions to get the language right. Those excuses are not convincing when we watch constitutional amendments introduced and passed in a matter of hours, or we see multi-million-dollar programs never once discussed in the appropriate committee, added to fiscal code bills just before the final vote. Our report compares PA to several neighbor states. Virginia's legislative session began on January 11th and ended on February 24th. In less than 2 months, their narrowly divided part-time legislature enacted 821 bills and fully completed their budget process. In the 6 months of our report, PA's full-time legislature fully enacted just 3 bills and failed to complete the budget process. That process is still incomplete 3 months past the start of the fiscal year. Bills enacted and timely budgets are just 2 benchmarks when measuring legislative effectiveness. A less accessible benchmark is voter confidence and trust in the process. From what we can see, that confidence is near zero. As voters and citizens, we are tired of seeing important bills held as leverage for partisan interests. And we are tired of seeing one person elected by a tiny fraction of PA voters able to block bipartisan solutions that have clear, well-documented public support. Give those bills a vote. Let us see where you stand. We are tired of seeing major policy issues tacked into fiscal code bills instead of being debated, discussed, and given a vote in the proper legislative process. We are tired of the mounting evidence of billionaire influence and industry control of agenda, budget, policy, and regulations. Pennsylvania, far more than most states, is held in the grip of outside interests. There are obvious ways to solve that. Give those bills a vote. In reality, we as citizens cannot fix Harrisburg on our own. We can research the process, we can educate voters, we can point towards solutions, we can demand reform. But at some point, the people we elect need to demand reform as well. For the sake of our Commonwealth, our future, and the future of this institution, we will do all we can to see that needed reforms happen. We ask our legislators to do the same.